Hello, this is my math lesson activity video. This video covers the math lesson plan that is also listed on the practicum portfolio, which I actually taught over the course of 2 sessions at my time at Paris Elementary. I'm very glad that I got to do that. The first time I taught it, there were some problems, and so I'd talk about that some in my reflection of the lesson plan, and we did things differently for the second section. Again, you can find all of this in the reflections, so without further ado, let's get started. So, the standard and objective for this lesson plan. 4.md.a.1. Measure and estimate to determine relative sizes of measurement units within a single system of measurement involving length, liquid volume, and mass or weight of objects using customary and metric units. And my objective is students will be able to demonstrate understanding of measurements by estimating which units are appropriate to measure with objects varying in size. This is a lesson I taught in Paris, so this is a Tennessee 4th grade math standard. My standard broken down. This standard covers several things, such as determining which measurement unit is appropriate for both customary and metric units, actually converting the units, again, customary and metric, converting mixed units, and converting units of time. We were just beginning to work with this standard. I believe this was taught on a Friday, and the goal of this was to assess students so that we could know where that they were at. And this was more of an introduction lesson, and because it's an introduction, we wanted to start with determining appropriate units of measurement, metric, and customary, and we also cover estimating appropriate units of time as well. So because this is an introduction, we don't really do much converting. We're just trying to see where students are at, and we're trying to give a brief introduction to estimating which unit is appropriate. So some example questions that would be in the assessment are, which is a better estimate for a semi-truck, 10 ounces or 10 tons? What is a better estimate for the length of a bus, 12 meters or 12 kilometers? So those are some not necessarily essential questions, but that's the type of questioning that we're going to deal with in this lesson. Just to give you an example of what we're going to cover in this lesson, looking at an object and saying, okay, for the length of a stop sign, I would measure the length of a stop sign in yards rather than miles, because miles would be way too big. So one strategy that I used was reference. In my introduction, I talk about using invented measuring and why it's easier for us to use standard units as opposed to invented measuring. During this section, we use items from all around the class as reference to create invented measuring to see how tall I am, and then we compare this with standard units. So I started by saying, okay, how tall do you guys think that I am? And I got not questions, I got answers all over the board. Students were super excited to predict the height of Mr. Kyler. I got 5'1". I got 6'11", very flattering. Students didn't surprisingly come up with invented measuring on their own. I had to bring up, okay, yes, we can measure me in feet and inches, and we can also measure me by your shoes. how many of your shoes tall am I? And why, that is one way to think about measurement, but why is it easier? Why do we automatically go to feet and inches? Guiding students through instruction. So, as I said, this was a introduction to the standard, and about half of the lesson is a scoot activity that serves as a pre-assessment to gauge how much time we need to spend covering this with students. So we do want to briefly talk about it. We're not going to cover it too much, but for the purpose of this activity video, I went ahead and just acted like I would teach a full section before the pre-assessment. So initially, it is the teacher's goal to get students thinking about how we can estimate units of measurement. And I do this by connecting students' prior knowledge of units of measurement to objects that they are familiar with around the classroom. So we're making connections here. They already have some prior knowledge of, okay, well, I know 1 foot is 12 inches. Well, we are now using that around the classroom and activating their prior knowledge and making connections to, okay, well, I know 1 foot is 12 inches, a foot is larger than an inch, and that's why we measure people with feet and then inches. We are selecting the appropriate unit of measurement by activating prior knowledge and making connections. That is the introduction. After the introduction, we go into the handout. In the handout, it is my role to encourage class discussion and to encourage students to, once again, make connections to the content. The handout gives examples of what we use units of measurement for in real life. For example, a bottle of water is 12 fluid ounces, so we would measure a bottle of water with fluid ounces. That is the most appropriate unit of measurement because it is not too large or too small. It is not a difficult number to realize. It's 12 fluid ounces, as it is easy to remember I am 6 feet and 1 inch as opposed to whatever the math is on that. 6 times 12, you know. So we have the handout, and that gives examples. They are fill in the blank examples. And so there's a lot, that's where the student discussion comes in. And when I was teaching this, it really showed that they had some prior knowledge in this because they knew about the appropriate units of measurement before we really even covered it, which is awesome. Guiding students through assessment. So the assessment for this activity, or the assessment for this lesson, is a scoot activity. Students needed a lot of guidance for the scoot activity. I can't necessarily guide the learning process because this is an assessment piece and I don't want to mess up that data. I want to gauge where they are without my help. Rather, my goal for guiding students through assessment is to keep them on track and focused so that the scoot activity goes smoothly and students are focused on working. When I taught this lesson, it was important to clearly let students know how much time they had to work on each problem and what is expected of them while waiting to move on to the next problem. A lot of students really needed to know how much time they had for each problem and when their time was almost up, and a lot of students also needed verbal, okay, we're not we're not doing dances right now. I know you've completed the math problem. That's awesome, but there's other people working. Because during the scoot activity, they're standing up, they're moving around, desk to desk, task card to task card. So there was a lot of verbal redirection. Differentiation in this lesson. In the class where I taught this lesson, we had one visually impaired student. My cooperating teacher suggested that we make large copies of the task cards and of the handout for the student. And we also allowed her to use a magnifying glass if she still needed help to read the cards. These large copies of the task cards, it, we had, they were for the visually impaired student, but they were at every desk. So every student used those enlarged copies to not single out the visually impaired student, because we don't want to have two copies out of each task card, as that would kind of confuse them, and it would also single out that student. Another differentiation I had to make for this lesson was time. During assessment, or planning of the assessment rather, I originally planned that students could do one problem every 30 seconds. The task cards really weren't very wordy. They were pretty straightforward, but however, several students did have trouble with 30 seconds per one problem. So what I did was, instead of saying, okay, 30 seconds, I would say, okay, time to start. And I would just look around the classroom and observe. And when everyone was almost done, I'd say, okay, get ready to switch, and let those students know that time was running out. But I did a lot more time for the class in general so that everyone had more time to work on their problems. Assessing struggling students. I was very fortunate to have my wonderful, awesome, cooperating teacher assisting me, as well as a teacher aide while I was teaching. They did an excellent job for struggling students. They were able to work one-on-one to explain units that these students were struggling with. And that's always a great help, because they were able to receive one-on-one help, and I was able to progress through the lesson at a normal pace without having to stop to explain my reasoning or address these questions. Not to say that I was ignoring these questions, but if a student had a question, they would silently raise their hand and they would receive help as needed. Adaptations for online teaching. So for online teaching, a Scoot activity is not doable. So that is right out the window. Instead of focusing on assessment, I would focus on teaching the skill, because right now we're in unprecedented, crazy times. Pre-assessment, post-assessment, it is very important. It is imperative to gauge where students are, what they've learned, and what they still struggle with. However, right now I feel the primary purpose of NTI should really be focused on actual instruction. So I would probably just throw out most of the assessment part and focus on actually teaching the skill. And I had a fun idea for a way that I could teach the lessons, and that would be to incorporate items that I and students have access to. For example, I could pick a variety of items around my house and show them to students over the video and ask them what unit they would measure this with. Some examples could include pencils, notebooks, cups, etc. For large items, obviously I can't bring a truck into my building and say, hey, would we weigh this with pounds, tons? Instead, I could create a slideshow with pictures or videos of the items, and students can estimate units of measurement through that. And for time measurements, I could show students something like a movie, and not actually watching a full movie, not showing them a movie, just, showing them the case of a movie, and asking, okay, if I were to watch this, how would I measure it? Would I use seconds? Would I use minutes? Or would I use hours? And then, this is my favorite part of this, is there's a NTI, it's a real struggle with keeping students' attention and keeping their attention spans. So after I have had some time to actually teach them the estimating units and I have got to show them some and we've got to practice some, I want to prompt them to be more engaged and get hands-on by asking them to look around and find an object, just for example, that you could weigh in pounds and tell me what that item is. And they're not, I want to make sure before we do this, I don't want them to get up and be running around and causing chaos. And it takes them 5 minutes to go into the kitchen and find something that weighs pounds. I want to make distinctly clear we are going to stay in our seats. We're just going to look around us and see if we can find something that weighs pounds. Obviously, we can't do this for all forms of measurement, especially the larger ones, but for that we can just say, think about items around your house or think about items outside. So that is how I would teach this online. I would focus more on instruction, less on assessment, although there is still room for assessment if needed. I could easily gauge student learning by having a slideshow at the end, or student learning could even be the scavenger hunt, where I say, find something that you would measure in cups and gauging their response as accurate or inaccurate and documenting that. So that is my math lesson video activity. Thank you very much for listening.